Now, the theory of the consumer. In the
Yes.
introduction part,
Mm-hmm.
The consumer behavior is introduced as a utility maximizing behavior, but subject to the budget constraint. Now, if you remember, under the introduction to microeconomics, the consumer is one of the economic agents that we have, and the objective of the consumer is to maximize what? Utility. So the consumer behavior is simply portrayed as a utility maximizing what? Behavior. But this one is subject to the budget constraint. So the budget constraint in this case simply refers to the income that the consumer has. So the consumer can enjoy or maximize that utility subject to the income that the consumer has. Now in this unit, we want to express that utility maximization and the budget constraint in a mathematical form. Now the consumer is portrayed as an agent who goes for the best that he or she can afford. Now, the objective of this topic, by the end of this topic, you should be able to state the budget constraint. That is, you should be able to formulate the budget constraint. Then, you should be able to determine the consumer preferences. Then, you should also be able to derive the consumer equilibrium using the indifference curve approach. And then you should be able to demonstrate the consumer demand functions. So those are the objectives of the topic. Now I think we need to look at the first part, which is the budget constraint. So the first step is to formulate the budget constraint. So if a consumer is consuming some two goods, so he has a consumption bundle, which can be X1 and X2. So of course, where X1 represents the number of units that the consumer chooses of wood 1, and X2 to represent the number of units of wood 2 to be chosen by the consumer. And we are assuming that the consumer is consuming a bundle of what? Woods, which is X1 and X2. So we can let P1 and P2 to represent the unit prices for the two goods respectively. We can also use M, that is capital M, to represent the amount of money the consumer has to spend. Now, given the information, that is the two bundles of goods and the prices and the income of the consumer, we can formulate the budget constraint of that consumer. Now, the budget constraint of the consumer can be written as P1 X1 plus P2 X2, which is equal to or less than M. And I said M represents the income of the consumer. So if you look at that inequality, it is represented as an inequality simply because the consumer can only spend up to the income that he has or less than the income he has. So P1 X1 from that inequality simply represents the expenditure on good 1, and the P2 X2 is the expenditure on the second good. Now that inequality is what we refer to as the budget constraint. So the consumer can only spend up to the income he has or less than the income he has. So if you look at that inequality well, what it simply means or what the budget constraint of that consumer requires is that the amount of money that is spent on the two goods should not be more than the total amount the consumer has to spend. So that's why it's represented as an inequality. So the total expenditure on the two goods should be equal to or less than the income. Now the set of affordable consumption bundles at prices P1 and P2 and income M is called the budget set of the consumer.
Budget set.
Yeah, it's called the budget set of the consumer. Now the set of bundles that cost exactly M is called the budget line. Now the set of bundles that completely exhaust the income of the consumer, that is the expenditure on the two goods which is equal to the income, is what we refer to as the budget line. So P1 X1 plus P2 X2, which is equal to M, is simply what we refer to as the budget line. Now this simply represents the bundle of goods that just exhaust the consumer's income. So the set of goods that exhaust the consumer's income completely, what we refer to as the budget line. Now if you look at the diagram that is presented, so the budget line is simply the straight line that we have on that Cartesian plane. So we have two goods, that is X1 and X2. So where that line cuts the y-axis, that is M over P2, and where it cuts the x-axis, that is M over P2. So that line is what we refer to as the budget line, and the slope of that budget line is simply negative P1 over P2. Now, if you look at that line, the area below the line, is what we refer to as the budget set. So the budget set simply contains the different combinations of what? X1 and X2 that the consumer can do what? Enjoy or consume. Now, if we go back to the budget line and rearrange the budget line equation, so we can make X2 the subject, or we can make X1 the subject. So if we make X2 the subject, what we have is M divided by P minus P1 over P2 X1. I think there's a problem there. This would be X1. Now, this is simply an equation of the straight line with an intercept. So the intercept M over P2. That's where that line cuts the y-axis, and the slope of P1 over P. So we have seen earlier the diagram that I presented. So that simply shows the budget line. Simply a straight line.
So
now, the budget
question.
Sorry, the slope of the budget line. Yes. Yes.
A question. If okay, so the gradient of the line, the gradient of the budget line should always be the price of commodity 1 over the price of commodity 2. That is the gradient of the budget.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Okay. So if you go back to that diagram, that is the line that is drawn. So on the y-axis, that is on the y-axis, we have commodity 2, that is X2, and on the x-axis we have commodity what? Commodity 1. So if you interchange now, X1 goes to the y-axis and X2 goes to the x-axis,
x-axis.
yeah, the slope will also change again to P2 over P1.
P1.
Yeah. So it depends where x1 is and where x2 is, that the two bundles. Now, the slope of the budget line simply measures the rate at which the market is willing to substitute wood 1 or wood 2. So the slope of the budget line simply measures simply what we refer to as the opportunity cost. So the opportunity cost, that is the amount of wood 2 that you can give up in order to get or to obtain one extra unit of wood 1. So the change in wood 2 over the change in wood 1 simply given as the slope of that line, which is negative P1 over P2. Yeah. So the slope of the budget line is the opportunity cost of consuming wood 1. It simply gives the amount of wood 2 that you can give up in order to get or to consume one extra unit of wood 1. So in order for the consumer to consume more of wood 1, it has to give up some consumption of wood 2. And that is measured by the slope of the budget line. Now, I think we are formulate what? The budget line. So if you are given the prices of the two goods and you are given the quantity of the two goods and the income, so you can simply formulate the budget constraint. So the budget constraint, which is given as an inequality, so it simply states that the consumption or the expenditure on the two goods should be equal to or less than the income. And that is what we refer to as the budget constraint of the consumer. So if you are able to formulate the budget constraint, then the next thing that we need to look at is consumer preferences. So what are consumer preferences? So the consumer preference is simply a complete list of goods and services that are involved in the choice problem facing the consumer. So the list of those goods and services where the consumer can choose from is what we refer to as the consumer preferences. So if we have two consumption bundles, for instance, that is X1, X2, that bundle, and Y1 and Y2 as another bundle, the consumer can determine that one of the bundles is strictly better than the other, or decide that is what? Indifferent. So if we take an example of the two bundles that I've said, that is X1, X2 as one bundle, and Y1 and Y2 as another. Now, since the consumer may not be able to consume the two consumption bundles, you will choose the best of the two bundles. So if we decide that X1, X2 is preferred than Y1, Y2, then you will do what? Consume X1 and X2. Or if we think that Y1, Y2 is more preferred than X1, X2, then the consumer will do what? Consume Y1, Y2. Now, the consumer can determine that one of the bundles is strictly better than the other. So if he has or he can rank what? His preferences. Or alternatively, can decide that the two bundles are equally the same. So which means he's indifferent. He can choose N without discrimination. Now we have some assumptions that guide the consumer preferences. So we have three assumptions that we can talk about consumer preferences. And the consumer preferences is normally made under assumptions. And the first assumption that we can discuss is what we refer to as completeness. So completeness means that it is assumed that n two bundles can be compared. So if you have two bundles, you can compare those bundles. So if you have a X bundle and a Y bundle, for example, and then in terms of preferences, X1, X2 is greater than Y1, Y2, or Y2, sorry, Y1 and Y2 is more preferred than X1, X2, or both, in which the consumer is indifferent between the two bundles. So that is what we refer to as completeness. You can compare the two bundles.
Excuse me,
Then
sir.
we have the second assumption. Yes.
Excuse me. Yeah. Question.
Yes.
If we're comparing X bundle and Y bundle with completeness, with the assumption of completeness, do we measure the size or something, or what is it?
No, it's not the size. It is the satisfaction. We talk about the preferences in terms of what satisfaction. So if you can derive more satisfaction from X1, X2, and less from Y1 and Y2, then you will prefer what? The bundle that gives you the maximum what satisfaction. Yeah, we talk in terms of satisfaction. Now the other assumption that we can discuss is reflexive. It's reflexive. So we assume that any bundle is at least as good as itself. So that means that the consumption bundle that you are enjoying is the best. That's what it means by it's as good as itself. So there's no any other consumption that is good than that. The last assumption that guides preferences is what we refer to as transitivity. So we have an assumption of transitivity. And what that means, if, for instance, X1, X2 is preferred to Y1, Y2, and Y1 and Y2 is preferred to Z1, Z2, then we assume that the consumer thinks that X is at least as good as Y, and Y is at least as good as Z. Then the consumer thinks X is as good as what? Z. So if X is more preferred to Y and Y is more preferred to Z, then there is no way you can prefer Y to Z than X to what? To Z. That is the assumption of transitivity that we talk about. Now, those are the assumptions that guides the consumer preferences. Now we can analyze the consumer preferences in terms of the indifference curves. So it is convenient to describe the consumer preferences graphically using difference curves. So if you consider a consumer's consumption of good 1 and good 2, so you can see that graph. So you can see the shaded region, and we have the consumption of those two goods, that is X1 and X2. So the consumer can consume a combination of the two goods, that is X1 and X2. Now the shaded region,
Okay.
if you can look at it, it is above the curve.
It's not visible.
And
It's not that visible.
oh, it is not that
It's
visible.
not clear. It's not clear.
Oh, I thought it's very clear.
No, no, no,
It's
no,
not very
no.
clear from your side. Oh,
It's not
okay.
clear.
Now, maybe you can make reference to the notes later. I think from the notes it's very clear. The slides, I think from your side, I think it may be not very clear. Now,
Okay.
the shaded region is simply, the shaded region is a region of the weakly preferred set. Now, the reason why it is weakly preferred, the consumer cannot afford the consumption that is above that shaded region because it requires more income. And therefore, the consumer can only spend along that line, along the curve, or
Yes.
below the curve. I'm saying the consumer can spend along the curve or below the curve.
So you cannot spend you
Now, if
on the shaded region.
I cannot spend on the shaded region because the bundles that lies in the shaded region requires more in terms of what? Income. And therefore, the consumer may not prefer that because the income is limited. Now, if X1 and X2 is a certain consumption bundle, can talk about that as a consumption bundle, then the consumption bundle in the shaded region, I said, is weakly preferred to X1, X2. And that area, that is the shaded region, is what we refer to as the weakly preferred set. Now, the bundles on the boundary of this set, that is on that curve, consists of the bundles of goods that leave the consumer indifferent. So if you look at that curve, along the curve, the consumer can have different combinations of X1 and X2. So those different combinations simply gives the same level of what? Satisfaction. So if you remember along the indifference curve, the level of satisfaction is simply the same. And therefore, when the consumer consumes along that line, is simply deriving the same satisfaction. And along that indifference curve, the consumer can have different combinations of X1 and X2. That is different bundles of the same what products that the consumer is consuming. Now, we have different shapes of indifference curves. There are different shapes of the indifference curves that we can talk about. So depending on the relationship between the two goods. And the first shape that we can discuss is perfect substitutes. So if I take you back to introduction to microeconomics that you discussed in your first semester, year 1. So perfect substitutes are those goods that the consumer can substitute one good. So if I substitute, for example, one piece of cloth for the other, that is perfect substitutes. So you simply substitute one good for the other in the same what rate. If it is 1, you exchange 1 for 1. If it is 2, you change 2 for 2. That is what we refer to as the perfect substitutes. Now, the indifference curve for perfect substitutes is simply parallel lines. So the indifference curve is given as parallel lines. So I hope you can see them on the slides. So they're given as parallel lines. So X2, X1, So we have linear indifference curves, so which simply reflects perfect substitution. So which means the consumer is substituting one good for the other at a constant rate.
But excuse me, question.
Yes. Yes.
Since the lines are, some of them are above the others, does it mean that
Yes.
his income increases with with this expenditure of a different substitute?
Okay. Those indifference curves that are above others, they simply represent a higher level of satisfaction. Now, what we mean along the same indifference curve, so if you move one indifference curve downwards and compute the slope is simply the same. So the first line has its own what slope, which is the same. So when the consumer moves down, so the rate of substitution is the same. So for the second what indifference curve, it's the same. The slope is the same when you move along the same indifference curve and compute the slope. So you'll realize that it is the same. That means the consumer is simply substituting one good for the other at the same constant rate. So that is what we mean. So the indifference curves are simply parallel lines. Yes.
By constant rate, you mean by constant rate, you mean same level of income, same level of expenditure for each and every single good, just different levels of satisfaction.
So for the constant rate, what I mean, for example, if we have two goods that we are consuming, now, so if we have two goods that we are consuming, and you want to increase the consumption of one for the other, over the other, so you reduce the consumption of 1 unit of X2, for example, and increase the consumption of X1 by 1 unit. So you are reducing by 1 unit, you are increasing by another 1 unit. That is what we refer to as constant rates. Yeah. So along the same indifference curve, the rate of substitution is simply constant. And the rate of substitution, we said, is simply the slope of the difference curve.
Okay.
Yeah. Then the second shape of indifference curves is that of perfect complements. So the perfect complements, these are goods that are consumed together in fixed proportions. That is what we refer to as the perfect complements. Now the indifference curves or the perfect complements are simply L-shaped. They are L-shaped. And the vertex of the L is occurring where?
Excuse me.
The number of one good, yes?
Excuse me,
Yes, you're excused.
Can you kindly minimize the page?
I minimize.
Yeah, you minimize.
Minimize or maximize?
You minimize, you don't maximize.
So I'm using the minimum one. Unless now, if I maximize, I think I don't know whether you'll be able to see. Let me maximize. Can you see now?
Yeah, I'm able to see now.
You're able to see?
Yeah, that's a bit clear.
Oh, okay. Now I said the second now is perfect complements, and I said complements are those goods that are consumed together in fixed proportions, and the indifference curves or for such goods are simply L-shaped. The vertex of the L occurs where the number of one good equals the number of the other good. So if we are consuming, for example, two goods, that is X1 and X2. So you can see where the vertex of the L is. So where that vertex is, it means those goods are consumed in fixed proportions, and at that point, those goods are equal at the vertex. So it is consuming the equal proportion, that's the same proportion of the goods at that vertex. Then we also have paired goods, different curves for paired goods. Now, what are these paired goods? So a paired good is simply a commodity that the consumer does not like. I know you are also consumers, and there is some goods that you don't like. Those goods that you don't like is what we refer to as the paired goods. So the consumer will have an indifference curve that slopes up and to the right. So as you can see from the diagram, so the indifference curves are simply upward sloping. Then we have neutral goods. We also have indifference curves for neutral goods. Now, a good is neutral if the consumer does not care about it in one way or the other. So if you don't care about the good that you consume in one way or the other, you can just consume without minding anything. That's what we refer to as the neutral goods. So the indifference curves for neutral goods are vertical. They are vertical. So you can see them if the two goods, that is X2 and X1, are neutral goods. So the indifference curve are simply vertical for neutral goods.
Excuse me on that neutral
Yes.
goods.
Yes.
Does it mean that if if it is a neutral good,
Yes.
someone purchases it without even consuming it, or else?
No, he consumes, but he doesn't care much about that good. So you can just buy and consume without minding whether there is other good or not.
What do you mean
So you are
by
indifferent.
consuming without caring much, really? Excuse?
Now, there are some goods that you buy without caring much. For example, let me take an example. Maybe wood that is it sugar? Sugar is just sugar.
Yes.
And some of the consumers may not worry so much what type of sugar, which company. Sugar is what? Is sugar. That's an example. So you are neutral. You can just buy any sugar that is in the supermarket or in the shop without minding where it came from. So in that's an example, that's a neutral good. Now,
So in the indifference,
shape,
hello, in the indifference
yes,
curves
I can
of
hear
the
you.
neutral goods, there
Yes.
are no curves for X2 because he doesn't absolutely care about X2.
Okay. There are you don't do what?
In the indifference curves of the neutral goods,
Yes.
there is no indication of any lines for X2.
Yeah, we have like I said, if you go to the supermarket, you want to buy sugar. We have different companies that have produced the sugar. And I said, since the sugar is simply sugar, you don't need to discriminate that this one is from another company, this one is more preferred. You just pick. So you don't care much where it came from. And in that case, the indifference curves are simply vertical. Yeah. Then we have the fifth shape of the indifference curves, and that is for imperfect substitutes. So for imperfect substitutes, the rate at which one good is substituted for another is not constant, but diminishing. So the two goods are said imperfect what? Substitutes. Now what we mean, so if you compute the slope of the indifference curve, it simply changes along the indifference curve. It diminishes along the indifference curve. So you can see, in that case, the indifference curves, there are simply curves that slopes downwards. So which shows that the rate at which one good is substituted for another diminishes along the indifference curve. And that is the indifference curves for imperfect substitutes. So for example, if you substitute x1 for x2, and the rate at which you substitute x1 for x2 changes along the indifference curves. So it will give you a curve that slopes downwards. So that simply means the rate at which you are substituting one good for the other is diminishing. And those are imperfect substitutes. And the imperfect substitute will have an indifference curve that is strictly convex to the origin. Now, those are the shapes of the indifference curves that we can talk about. Yeah. Any question? Now you can ask questions and clarifications. Gabriel?
I have a question.
Yes, Gabriel, you can ask something.
So it means that generally in these indifference curves we are not competing, or
They are?
I mean in these indifference curves,
Yes.
it means there is no any comparison about the cost of the goods, because on the neutral goods,
Mm-hmm.
where you gave us an example of sugar. So how about if the price of the sugar 1 kg from Mias is greater than even 1 kg from Cabras? Will one compare about the price also?
Mm-hmm. Now, in this case, we don't look at the cost, we look at the satisfaction you derive from those goods. So if you take 1 kg of sugar from Mumias and another one from Moroni, so the satisfaction you derive is simply the same. And therefore, you will be indifferent. You may not, you will be indifferent. You may not mind so much whether this is Mumias or this is Moroni, because the satisfaction is simply the same.
I have a question.
Yeah. Brian, you can ask. Yes.
On each and every, most of these graphs that you've given us, there
Yes.
are, for example, for the imperfect substitutes, that's the slide that is on right now.
Yes.
There are four curves that are showing. 4 of them.
Yeah. Okay.
These curves represent these curves represent bundles for goods X2 and X1. Now
No,
I
it
wonder.
doesn't represent. Yes.
Now I wonder, does this other 4 do these other 3 represent other bundles or what exactly?
Now, yes, let me take you back to the introduction to microeconomics 1. I think that's where you did this. Now, these are simply indifference curves, and a higher indifference curves represent a higher level of what? Satisfaction. So the lowest, that is the first indifference curves, you can see, it simply represents a lower level of satisfaction. So as you move up, you are simply consuming more of commodity X1 and X2, and that simply gives a higher level of what? Consumption. So the higher the indifference curve is, the higher the level of satisfaction. So that's what it represents.
Okay.
But the concept is So we could use one in different curves. We could use one in different curve. So it simply shows the rate of substitution downwards. As you move, for example, along the x2 axis. So if you move along the
I was
x2
wondering
axis,
this.
yes.
I was
Hello?
wondering this was if,
Yes.
for example, in a real situation, will you be asked to be plotted? Will you be asked to plot the indifference curves of different levels of satisfaction, because that requires different equations which are not indicated in any of your notes.
Now, under normal circumstances, what you need to understand is this: that a consumption bundle that gives a higher level of satisfaction should be represented by a higher difference curve. So if you have consumption bundles and you can rank them, so the one that has a higher level of satisfaction should be represented by an indifference curve that is higher than the other one, in simple terms.
Okay. So you will not be asked to plot any of these other indifference curves.
Now, maybe if we can ask you to just draw the diagrams for maybe indifference curves for the imperfect substitute for neutral goods, just like that. But what you need to remember is this: in Introduction to Microeconomics 1, I think you discussed the approaches to the measurement of utility. And we have two approaches. The first one is the ordinal approach and the cardinal approach. So the cardinal approach simply means you cannot measure utility, but you can use you can rank. That is using the indifference curves, and we use the indifference curves to rank the satisfaction. So the other one, that is the ordinal, simply assumes that utility can be measured, and in this case you can measure utility in terms of units, so which are called the utils. So in this case we have used the indifference curve to simply represent levels of satisfaction. Yeah.
Okay.
Any other question? There's somebody called Dipora. Dipora, you can ask a question. Stephen, ask something.
There is something I haven't understood well.
Yes, which one?
The bad substitute.
The bad goods. On the bad goods,
Yeah.
I said that is a good that you really don't like. And if I can give an example, do you eat samosa?
Yes.
Now we may have two types of samosa: the one that has pepper and the other one which doesn't have. So if you don't like pepper, would you eat the samosa that has pepper? Yeah?
No, I don't.
You won't eat it. Yeah. So you don't like it. Yeah, that's the best example I can give of a bad good, a good that you don't like. So if you don't eat samosa, if you don't eat pepper, and then you are given a samosa that has pepper, you won't eat it.
Yes.
So that's a bad good. Yes, that's what I mean.
Okay, I've understood.
Okay. Any other question?
Clarification.
Brian, you can ask.
Mine have been answered.
Okay. Any other?
No, none for now.
Okay. I think that's a brief introduction. What I will recommend, you have the handout. The handout, I think it's more detailed. You go through the notes. They may have some illustrations on what we have discussed, like the examples of bad goods. It gives that illustration, which is a bad good. So imperfect substitutes, it can give examples. So you go through the handout, read, and then I want to post some questions on the discussion forum. So that you contribute to the discussion forum before we can stop.
Excuse me.
Yes.
On the discussion forum, are we going to discuss on one?
Now I will simply post a question, then you reply to the question. That's
So
the
it will
discussion.
act
It's
as an
simply written. I write, then you. Sorry.
You write it here.
No, on the portal, because it's recorded on the portal. You contribute to the discussion I raise in the portal, so that it simply checks on your understanding of what we have discussed. You are still on your portal.
Yes.
Yes.